Digital debate for the UK. Talk Radio. We'll get you talking.
Richard in for Matthew. Last topic before we hit the news at 2. Road rage incidents in the UK are rising, according to the latest research. Auto Trader has found 1 in 10 road users were involved in some kind of altercation that turned physical last year. So there are many more that don't actually get physical, but are extremely hostile, very verbal. Ford did a similar survey just a few weeks ago, found very, very similar figures. Half of people surveyed say they faced aggression, or they've been sworn at when they're on the road, and a fifth say they've really feared for their own safety. It's getting worse. Joining us in the studio now is psychologist Honey Langcaster-James. Yourself a victim of road rage?
I was once. Thankfully, nothing physical happened, but I basically got in the wrong lane. I was in the wrong in that respect.
Well, we all make mistakes.
Yeah, we all make mistakes, exactly. And basically, a guy in his car pulled up right alongside me, wound his window down and started effing and blinding at me and saying I shouldn't be driving, used a lot of gender-related slurs, and I was genuinely intimidated. And actually I was quite shaken, so it didn't help. I was driving in an area that was unfamiliar to me, and that's probably why I was in the wrong lane. And so, of course, off I went. But I was visibly shaking. I had to pull over and calm down. Did
it help that you're a psychologist, that you were able to analyse, as it were, what was happening and step back from it, see it as a kind of a bit of social interaction rather than a direct threat to you?
I think in the moment, it didn't make it any less intimidating. Probably my sort of knowledge of the fight or flight response made sure that I pulled over to allow myself to calm down, because I know that, obviously you get very heightened response, your heart rate starts racing, you get very hot and sweaty, and you start to over-focus on certain features, and you can miss other things. So I sort of pulled over and I calmed down, which is what I would do if I'm in that kind of response. And I think that's quite important, actually.
Well, I want to ask you about, if you like, the psychological toolkit that we need to pack in our cars these days so we can deal with road rage when it happens. Have you suffered from it, Kevin?
No, I haven't. I was going to ask Honey whether or not she thinks it's a bloke thing, because I must admit I am one of those furious drivers. I drive around screaming at everybody through the windscreen. I hold myself back from getting out of the car and fighting. Right. But do you think it's a male thing?
As much as I hate to sort of stereotype too much on gender, I do think that men are more likely on the roads to express their frustration and their anger. Many women will tend to sort of feel equally upset or very angry about somebody being on the road and probably under their breath mutter something. But when it comes to actually sort of verbalising and expressing that disdain towards another human being, I think women are more likely to go away and complain to someone else.
More emotionally mature is what you're saying.
Well, I don't know if it's that. I mean, possibly we're less likely to want to get involved in a confrontation.
Well,
Well, you see, it could be that as well.
But of course, men having a bit more testosterone coursing through their system and all the rest of it. I mean, somebody pulls up next to you, you don't even know you've done anything wrong to annoy them, and maybe you haven't, whatever. They pull up and they start abusing you. As a man, the instinctive response is to fight back.
Yes.
It's not really to drive away, which I do. I managed to overcome that. Can you give us some pointers for men and women? What should we do when something like this happens? What's our best way of defusing the situation? Is it by talking to ourselves, as it were? Is it simply by leaving the scene? You take us through it.
Well, the best thing you could actually do is really try your very best not to react and not to respond to the aggressor in that instance, because the reality is you're still in charge of a car. You're still in an environment where you've got to have your wits about you on the road. So the best thing to do actually is to control your breathing if you can. One of the things I teach my clients is a 6-second breath technique. It just basically means that no matter how heightened your response is, whether you're angry, whether you're upset, whether you're anxious, if you slow your breathing down and you try to breathe in for the count of slow 6 counts and out for the count of 6 counts, and you try to do that 6 times, your body sort of can't help but physiologically relax, and that's very calming. So the best thing to do is to calm yourself, because the reality is if you do retaliate and you start sort of giving back as good as you've got, it is possible that could lead to something really, really unpleasant, and it could get rather dangerous, not to mention the fact that you could be causing a blockage in the road.
And what is it about, in particular, men, which makes them behave in this way only when they're behind the wheel of a car. And I know
Yeah.
that there are exceptions where there are men who are violent anyway. But I remember vividly when I was a newspaper reporter, and before the phrase road rage was even heard of, covering a court case of a man who'd got out of his car and attacked another driver for cutting him up at the lights, that kind of thing. And in his defence, as part of, and he pleaded guilty, but as part of mitigation, he had a string of witnesses to say that he was the sweetest, kindest, gentlest, nicest man. He had no record for violence or anything, and yet he flipped his stack and had caused quite serious injuries to the face of this other driver. What is it about being in a car behind the wheel that turns otherwise law-abiding, peace-loving people into monsters?
Well, there's a couple of things at play. I think one is a kind of social conditioning that's come about in recent years. Actually, I think it's rather unhelpful to have phrases such as road rage, because what it actually does is it sort of normalises it, and it almost gives permission to the fact that you're on the road, you're allowed to be enraged. Well, actually, you're not. You know, we all have frustrations in life. We all have irritations, whether you're getting on the tube or you're getting on a bus and people are in your way. Just because you've got a car around you shouldn't give you the sort of permission to get enraged about it. I think actually that added element of having a sort of metal tank wrapped around you gives you a sort of false sense of security and protection. But also there is something psychologically about when you're travelling, you kind of feel like you, as long as you follow the rules, as long as you get in the right lane and you follow all the traffic lights, that you should be able to get from A to B without obstacle and without anybody getting in your way. There's a sort of sense of entitlement that comes with travelling. And so if someone actually breaks those rules,
impedes you,
then it's seen as a real affront to what the kind of social rules are, because we all have social rules. If you think about when we walk down the street, especially us Brits, you know, someone sort of brushes into you and you go, oh, sorry, then you think, well, it wasn't really me. But when you're on the road, it's totally different. When you're on the road, it's totally different, because what you actually have is very explicit rules about how society is supposed to function. When the red light's there, you are supposed to stop. So everybody knows what those rules are, and as a result, if you see someone violating them, even unintentionally or even because they've, like me, you know, just happened to get in the wrong lane, we have a very low level of tolerance for it, because otherwise the whole system kind of comes to a stop.
Lest we forget, road rage only in the recent years has led to at least 2 murders I can remember.
Yes.
2
murders, Kenneth Noy stabbed a guy in a fight over a lane in a dual carriageway, and I think it was only last year. It was a really tragic story of an old grandfather, was about 75. Some young guy cut him up there around, he killed him.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you sort of look at those kind of really extreme cases, often when you look under the surface, there are latent difficulties that person's having with anger, perhaps unexpressed anger, or perhaps other irritations and stresses in their life that then seems to get a sort of elevated permission when they're on the roads. And it's almost as if this is when I'm allowed to vent my anger because of, you know.
Well, I'll tell you what I say to myself, and it's probably happened 5 times in the last 10 years that somebody's pulled up alongside me, they tailgated me, whatever, and they've been very aggressive and threatening and abusive. I mean, the temptation is to shout back, but I never do, because I always say to myself, do you know if that guy's got a knife on him?
Exactly.
Yes. Do you know if that guy's actually got a screwdriver in his in the side
period
pocket
of living
his car?
in America will prepare you for this. That's I lived there for 9 years in the 90s. Every time there's a confrontation, you go, that guy could have a gun. And you go, no, let's not argue.
No traffic jam, no wrong turn is worth, taking that on. Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's just gone 2 o'clock. This is the Matthew Wright Show with Richard Madeley on Talk Radio in partnership with Imagine Cruising, more than just a cruise. You can find out more at imaginecruising.co.uk, and we're back after this.
Talk Radio. Listen, phone, talk.
Talk Radio.
We'll get you talking.